I still remember the exact moment my entire life split into two parts. There was everything that came before that phone call and everything that came after. If someone had asked me that morning whether I had a normal family, I would have answered without hesitation. My parents had been married for more than 3 decades. My 2 younger brothers and I had grown up believing we knew everything that mattered about our family history. We weren't perfect, but we were close. We celebrated birthdays together, spent Thanksgiving at my grandmother's house every year, and argued over the same silly things every family argues about. Looking back now, I realize how little we actually knew. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 28 years old, and until a few years ago, I thought the biggest challenge my family would ever face was watching my parents grow older. I never imagined we'd discover that my father had been carrying a secret almost as old as his marriage, a secret that had a name, a face, a family, and a little boy whose life depended on us. Even now, saying those words out loud doesn't feel real. It all started on a quiet Tuesday afternoon while I was finishing paperwork at work. My phone buzzed with a text from my younger brother, Ryan. "Call me right now." That wasn't like him. Ryan was the kind of person who usually texted memes or asked if anyone wanted to grab dinner. He wasn't dramatic. If he said to call immediately, something was seriously wrong. My first thought was that something had happened to our mom. By the time he answered, my heart was pounding. "Emily," he said quietly. There was something in his voice I'd never heard before. "What happened? Is Mom okay?" There was a long silence, then he took a deep breath. "Dad has another son." For a second I honestly thought I'd misheard him. "What? He has another son?" I laughed, not because it was funny. Because my brain refused to process what he'd just said. "What are you talking about?" I wish I was joking. I sat down so quickly that my office chair rolled backward. "No. Ryan, that's impossible." "I thought so too." Another long silence. "He's 32. I couldn't speak. 32, that was older than me. My hands started shaking. Ryan continued. "He was born shortly after Mom and Dad got married. It felt like someone had punched all the air out of my lungs. I kept waiting for him to say it was some misunderstanding, some DNA test mistake. Anything. Instead he said something even worse. He contacted us because his little boy needs a bone marrow transplant. Everything went silent. I wasn't thinking about my father anymore. I wasn't thinking about betrayal. I was picturing a little kid fighting for his life. "Wait," I whispered. "Start from the beginning." Ryan explained everything as best he could. A private investigator had tracked our family down. The man who contacted us wasn't asking for money. He wasn't threatening anyone. He wasn't trying to destroy our family. He was simply a father trying to save his son. Apparently, doctors had told him that biological relatives might be his son's best chance of finding a matching bone marrow donor. That search had led straight to us. I kept interrupting Ryan. "Does Dad know him?" "Yes." "How long has he known?" "For years." "Mom?" "No." "Us?" "No." Every answer felt heavier than the last. By the time we hung up, I couldn't remember how long I'd been staring at the wall. Nothing around me looked different. The office was just as noisy as before. People were still laughing. Printers were still running, emails were still arriving, yet somehow the entire world had changed. I drove straight to my parents' house after work. Cars were already parked outside. Ryan was there. Our youngest brother, Noah, had arrived minutes before me. Neither of them looked like they'd slept. Ryan hugged me without saying a word. Inside the house, the silence was unbearable. Our father sat at the dining room table staring at the floor. I'd never seen him look so small. For years he'd been the man who fixed everything, the man everyone relied on. Now he couldn't even look his own children in the eye. "Where's Mom?" I asked. Nobody answered. Finally Noah spoke. "Grandma came and picked her up." That sentence alone told me everything. My mother had left. I walked into the kitchen hoping someone would explain what was happening. Instead, I found 3 untouched cups of coffee sitting on the counter. Hours had passed. Nobody had even thought about drinking them. Dad finally looked up. "I'm sorry." Those were the first words he'd spoken since I'd arrived. Nobody answered. "I'm sorry," he repeated. Ryan folded his arms. "Sorry for what?" Dad looked away again. "It was a mistake." Noah let out a bitter laugh. "A mistake?" Dad nodded. "It happened once." I don't know why those words made me angry. Maybe because they sounded rehearsed. Maybe because they sounded like something he'd been telling himself for decades. Once. As though one night could somehow explain 32 years of lies, I finally spoke. "So, you've known about him his whole life?" He nodded slowly. "Yes." "You've been sending money?" Another pause. "Yes." "Did Mom know where that money was going?" "No." Ryan slammed his hand against the table. So you lied to her for over 30 years, Dad didn't answer. None of us noticed the tears running down Noah's face until he wiped them away with his sleeve. He wasn't crying because we suddenly had an older brother. He was crying because the man he'd admired his whole life suddenly felt like a stranger. I wanted answers, thousands of them. Had Dad ever spent time with this family? Did he love the other woman? Did he have another secret life? How many birthdays had he missed? How many lies had he told Mom? But every question felt too big to ask. Instead, I asked the only thing I could think of. How sick is his son? Dad rubbed his forehead. I don't know everything. Ryan stared at him. You don't know? They don't really talk. That confused all of us. What do you mean? He wasn't involved in his son's life. The room went quiet again. Apparently my father had sent financial support over the years, but he'd never actually been a father. His oldest son had met him only once as a college student. Then years later they met again because of the bone marrow testing. That was it, less than 30 minutes together across an entire lifetime. Somehow, that made everything even sadder. Not only had my father betrayed our mother, he had failed the son he'd kept hidden too. That night, none of us knew what would happen next. We didn't know if our parents' marriage could survive. We didn't know whether any of us would be a bone marrow match. And we definitely didn't know that this heartbreaking secret was only the beginning of a story that would completely reshape our family forever. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept replaying the same conversation over and over. Dad has another son. It still didn't sound like something that belonged to my family. It sounded like the plot of a movie or one of those unbelievable stories you read online and assume could never happen to you. By 6 the next morning, I gave up on trying to sleep and made myself a cup of coffee. I stood by my apartment window watching the sun come up, wondering where my mom had slept and whether she'd managed to get even a few hours of rest. I sent her a simple text, I love you. I'm here whenever you're ready. She didn't reply. That wasn't like her. My mom had always been the person who answered every message within minutes. Even if she was busy, she'd send a quick heart emoji or tell me she'd call later. Her silence scared me more than anything. Around 9 o'clock, Ryan called. Grandma says Mom doesn't want visitors yet. I closed my eyes. Is she okay? As okay as someone can be after finding out her husband lied to her for more than 30 years. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then Ryan sighed. The hospital called. My stomach tightened. They want us to start the testing process. It suddenly became real. This wasn't just about family secrets anymore. There was a little boy waiting to find out whether someone in our family could save his life. 2 days later, the three of us walked into the transplant center together. Ryan tried making jokes in the waiting room. Noah stared at the floor. I kept filling out forms even though I'd already checked them twice. A nurse called my name first. After looking through my medical history, she gave me an apologetic smile. I'm sorry, she said gently. Because of your previous cancer treatment, you're not eligible to donate. I already knew that might happen. My oncologist had warned me years earlier that certain types of donations wouldn't be possible. Still, hearing it out loud hurt more than I expected, not because I wanted to prove anything, but because somewhere out there was a child who needed help, and I couldn't even try. When I walked back into the waiting room, Ryan looked at my face and immediately understood. They said no, I nodded. They can't test me. He wrapped one arm around my shoulders. We'll do it. Noah nodded too. So will I. Later that afternoon, my uncle arrived at the hospital. Then 2 of our cousins. None of them had been asked. They simply showed up and volunteered. Watching them reminded me that families aren't defined only by their worst moments. Sometimes they're defined by the people who quietly step forward when someone needs help. That evening, Grandma finally called. Your mother wants to see you. I drove to my grandmother's house feeling more nervous than I had before any job interview or doctor's appointment. Grandma opened the door before I even knocked. She hugged me tightly. She's in the living room. My mother looked different, not physically, emotionally. It was like someone had taken away the warmth that normally filled every room she entered. Her eyes were swollen from crying. There were unopened tissues scattered across the coffee table. When she saw me, she smiled. It was the saddest smile I'd ever seen. I sat beside her without saying anything. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then she reached over and held my hand. I keep thinking I must have missed something. You didn't. I've gone through every year of our marriage. She stared at the fireplace. Every vacation, every business trip, every late meeting. I keep asking myself where he was. I squeezed her hand. You didn't deserve this. She shook her head slowly. I loved your father. Those 5 words nearly broke me. Not love, loved, past tense. She wasn't angry, not in that moment, she was heartbroken. There were 34 years, Emily. She looked at me. 34 years. How do you lie to someone every single day for that long? I didn't have an answer. Because there wasn't one. A few days later, Dad asked if the 3 of us would meet him. None of us wanted to, but we also knew avoiding him forever wasn't realistic. We met at his house. The same dining room, the same table, only this time it felt colder. He looked exhausted, older, like he'd aged 10 years in a week. I know you all hate me. Ryan didn't respond. Dad looked at each of us. I never stopped loving your mother, Noah spoke first. If that's true, why? Dad rubbed his face. It was a mistake. Ryan's jaw tightened. There it is again. Dad looked confused. What? A mistake? Ryan leaned forward. You keep saying those words like they explain everything. They don't. You lied for 32 years. You secretly sent money. You let Mom build an entire life around a lie. Dad opened his mouth but couldn't answer. I finally asked the question that had been bothering me. Why didn't you tell us when his son got sick? Dad looked away. I hoped it wouldn't come to this. You hoped your grandson wouldn't need us. No, I hoped they'd find another donor. Another silence. Then Dad admitted something that made the room even colder. He told me he was going to hire a private investigator if I wouldn't help him. You tried to stop him? Dad nodded. I told him not to contact any of you. Ryan stared at him in disbelief. You knew your grandson might die, and you were still trying to protect your secret. Dad didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence was answer enough for the first time in my life. I couldn't recognize the man sitting across from me. For the next week, it felt like our entire family was living in 2 different realities at the same time. One reality revolved around hospitals, phone calls, blood tests, and hoping someone, anyone, would turn out to be a bone marrow match for my nephew. The other revolved around my parents' marriage falling apart in slow motion. Neither reality gave us much room to breathe. By the end of the week, word had spread through the family. Not because we wanted it to, but because there was no way to explain why so many relatives were suddenly volunteering for medical testing without telling them at least part of the truth. My grandmother handled it better than anyone expected. She refused to gossip. Whenever someone started criticizing my mother for leaving the house, Grandma shut the conversation down immediately. This isn't about choosing sides, she told them. This is about supporting my daughter while she decides what comes next. I loved her for that. Unfortunately, not everyone shared her attitude. Some relatives insisted my parents should work things out. Others argued that what happened decades ago shouldn't matter anymore. One distant cousin even said, it was a long time ago. Why throw away 34 years over one mistake? When Ryan heard that, he nearly exploded. One mistake, he said. The affair might have happened once, but the lying happened every single day for 34 years. I couldn't disagree. That was the part people who weren't living through this seemed to miss. It wasn't just the affair, it was the birthdays, the anniversaries, the holidays, every family photo. Every promise my father had made while knowing there was a huge piece of the truth he'd chosen to hide. A few days later, I finally spoke to my older brother for the first time. Even after everything we'd learned, calling him my brother still felt strange. Ryan texted me his number and asked if I wanted to reach out. I stared at my phone for nearly an hour before I finally pressed call. He answered on the second ring. Hello, his voice sounded calm, but tired. Hi. This is Emily. There was a brief silence. I wasn't sure if you'd ever call. I wasn't sure either. To my surprise, he laughed softly. I guess we're both figuring this out. Some of the tension disappeared instantly. We spent the first few minutes talking awkwardly. Neither of us knew what to say. How do you introduce yourself to someone who's technically been your sibling your entire life? Eventually, I asked the question that had been on my mind since all of this started. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why now? He was quiet for a moment. I never wanted to turn your lives upside down. I believed your father when he said your family was better off not knowing about me. That sentence made my chest tight. I spent years wondering if maybe he was right, but when my son got sick, his voice cracked for the first time. Nothing else mattered. I didn't interrupt. I would have done anything to save him. If hiring a private investigator was my last option, then that's what I was going to do. There wasn't an ounce of bitterness in his voice. Just exhaustion, the exhaustion of a father who had run out of options. I wasn't looking for money, he continued. I wasn't looking for revenge, I just wanted to know that I'd tried everything. I felt tears building in my eyes. I'm glad you called us. So am I. As we kept talking, I learned more about his life. His mother had raised him on her own. She'd never spoken badly about my father. In fact, she'd encouraged him not to hate him. I couldn't understand that kind of grace. Growing up, he'd always known who his biological father was, but he also knew that my father wasn't interested in being part of his life. When he was in college, curiosity finally got the better of him. He reached out. They met for less than half an hour at a small coffee shop. My father admitted he was his dad. He apologized. Then he asked him not to contact the family. After that, years passed, no birthdays, no Christmas cards, no phone calls, nothing. The second time they met was after my nephew's diagnosis. Again. Less than 30 minutes. I tried to imagine how painful that must have been, to meet your own father only twice in your entire life, to know he had another family, to know he'd chosen them. And yet, my brother never blamed us, not once. I hope you know something, he said quietly. You and your brothers didn't do anything wrong. I've never been angry with any of you. Those words meant more than I can explain. Because deep down, I think all three of us had been carrying guilt that didn't belong to us. Before we hung up, I finally asked about my nephew. How's he doing? There was a long pause. It depends on the day. Some days he had enough energy to play. Other days he barely wanted to get out of bed. He was only 7 years old. 7. At that age, kids should be worrying about homework or soccer practice, not hospitals, not chemotherapy. Not waiting for strangers to tell them whether someone somewhere might be able to save their life. He knows he's sick, my brother said. But he doesn't really understand how serious it is. I swallowed hard. He just keeps asking when he can go back to school. After we ended the call, I sat in silence for a long time. I realized something then. For days, our family had been consumed by betrayal, anger, and heartbreak, but somewhere in another part of the city. There was a little boy whose biggest dream was simply to feel well enough to play with his friends again. Suddenly, everything else felt a little smaller. 3 days later, the transplant coordinator finally called with the first round of test results. Ryan wasn't a match, neither was Noah. My uncle wasn't a match. One cousin had been ruled out immediately. The other cousin wasn't compatible either. One by one, every hope we'd been holding on to quietly disappeared. I looked at my phone after Ryan texted the update. All it said was, "None of us matched." I stared at those 4 words, feeling completely helpless. I didn't know it then. But the person who would eventually save my nephew's life wasn't someone any of us had even considered. The day we learned that none of us were a match, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Even though we'd all tried to prepare ourselves for that possibility, actually hearing it was different. For nearly 2 weeks, our family had been holding on to the hope that one of us might be able to help. Now that hope was gone. Ryan called me that evening. "I don't know what to do," he admitted. "You don't have to do anything," I told him. "We already did everything we could. Doesn't feel like enough." It didn't, not even close. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking about my nephew constantly. I'd never met him. He had no idea who I was, but somehow I already cared about him. Every time my phone rang, I expected bad news. Every time I saw a child laughing in a grocery store or running through a park, I'd wonder if my nephew would ever get to have a normal childhood again. It was strange how quickly someone could become family, not because of shared memories, but because of shared blood. A week later, my older brother called. There was something different in his voice. Not happiness, not exactly, but hope. "I wanted to give you an update. I've been thinking about you guys," I said. "I know, the transplant team expanded the search." I held my breath. "They're checking unrelated donors now." I knew how difficult that could be. Finding a perfect bone marrow match from someone who wasn't related was incredibly rare. Still, it was better than having no options at all. "How's your son? He's hanging in there." There was a pause. "He asked me yesterday if he'd be healthy enough to play baseball next summer." I smiled without realizing it. "What did you tell him?" I told him that's exactly what we're working toward. I could hear him taking a deep breath. I don't let him see how scared I am. I didn't know what to say. Because if I were in his position, I wasn't sure I'd be that strong. Meanwhile, things at home continued getting worse. Mom still hadn't returned to the house. She'd started meeting with a lawyer. None of us tried to change her mind, not because we wanted our parents to divorce, but because we understood why she couldn't simply pretend nothing had happened. One afternoon, she invited me over to see the apartment she'd been looking at. It wasn't large, just a quiet 2-bedroom flat with a small balcony overlooking a neighborhood park. As we walked through the empty rooms, she smiled sadly. "I never imagined I'd be starting over at 62. I looked around, fresh paint, new carpet, empty walls waiting for pictures. It doesn't feel like home yet. It will. She looked at me for a long moment. You know what hurts the most? I shook my head. I thought I knew your father better than anyone. She looked out the balcony window, but now I don't know which memories were real and which ones were built on lies. There was nothing I could say to fix that. Some wounds don't heal with words. Dad called me a few days later. I almost didn't answer, but eventually I picked up. Hi, sweetheart. I hadn't heard him call me that since all of this started. I just wanted to check on you. I'm okay. It wasn't true. Neither of us mentioned it. After a long silence, he asked something that surprised me. Have you talked to him? He didn't even say my brother's name. Yes. Another pause. What's he like? I couldn't believe the question. You don't know? No, you've met him twice. I know. His voice was barely above a whisper. I don't really know him. I closed my eyes. That sentence said everything. A father asking his daughter what his own son was like. It was heartbreaking and completely his own doing. He's kind, I answered honestly. He loves his family. He's doing everything he can to save his little boy. Dad didn't respond. I continued. He never said a bad word about you. That seemed to surprise him. He didn't know. He could have, but he didn't. For several seconds, all I heard was quiet breathing on the other end of the line. Finally, Dad spoke. I don't deserve that. No, I said softly, you don't. About 2 weeks later, Ryan called while I was driving home. His voice was shaking. For a second, I thought something terrible had happened. Instead, he almost shouted into the phone. They found a match. I pulled my car onto the side of the road. What? They found someone. Who? I don't know all the details yet. I just know they found a compatible donor. I felt tears filling my eyes. Are you serious? Yeah, the transplant coordinator called my brother this morning. For the first time since this nightmare began, there was real hope, not hope built on wishful thinking. Hope backed by medicine, hope backed by another human being willing to save a stranger's life. Neither of us knew anything about the donor, only that somewhere, someone had said yes. And because of that decision, a 7-year-old boy had another chance to grow up. When Ryan called to tell me they'd found a donor, I cried harder than I had since this whole nightmare began. For weeks, every phone call had brought more bad news. No match, another delay, another round of tests, another reminder that time wasn't on my nephew's side. For the first time, it felt like we were finally moving in the right direction. That night, the three of us, Ryan, Noah, and I, met for dinner. It was the first time we'd all sat down together without spending the entire evening talking about our dad. Instead, we talked about my nephew. What if the transplant works? Noah asked. Ryan smiled. Then maybe next summer he'll finally get to play baseball. We all smiled. It was a small moment, but it felt good to imagine something beyond hospitals and family secrets. A few days later, my older brother called me. I wanted you to hear it from me, he said. The donor officially accepted. That's incredible. I still can't believe it. Neither could I. Then he told me something I wasn't expecting. The donor isn't related to us. I know, but here's the unbelievable part. He laughed quietly. She's my wife's cousin's girlfriend. I blinked. Wait, what? I know, out of everyone, that's who matched. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The odds seemed impossible. Millions of people in donor registries. Yet somehow, someone who had already crossed paths with their extended family turned out to be the match. Life has a strange way of surprising you. Several weeks later, the transplant took place. Those were probably the longest days any of us had lived through. Even though we weren't at the hospital, our phones never left our hands. Every vibration made my heart race. Every missed call sent my anxiety through the roof. Finally, late that evening, my phone rang. It was my brother. It went well. I leaned against my kitchen counter as tears filled my eyes. Really? Yeah, the doctors are happy. It's going to be a long recovery, but we got through the hardest part. I don't think I've ever been so relieved for someone I'd only known for a few. Recovery wasn't easy. There were setbacks, days when my nephew had no energy, days when everyone worried about infection, days when progress felt painfully slow, but little by little. Things started getting better. One afternoon, my brother sent me a picture. It showed my nephew sitting outside wearing a baseball cap that looked much too big for him. He was smiling, a real smile. Underneath the picture, my brother had written, "First day outside in almost a month." I must have looked at that photo 20 times, not because it was a remarkable picture, but because it represented hope. Around that same time, something unexpected happened. My brother asked if we'd like to meet, not over the phone, not through messages, in person, I won't lie. I was nervous. Ryan was nervous too. Noah admitted he'd barely slept the night before. How do you meet someone who has technically been your sibling your entire life, but is also a complete stranger? We agreed to meet at a quiet park halfway between our homes. I spotted him almost immediately. We looked similar, not identical, but there were little things. The same dark hair, the same smile, the same habit of folding our arms when we were nervous. Standing beside him was his wife, holding his hand, was the little boy we'd all been praying for. My nephew, he looked smaller than I'd imagined, still thin from treatment, but he was smiling. My brother walked toward us slowly. For a second, nobody knew who should speak first, then he smiled. I guess this is a pretty unusual family reunion. We all laughed. The tension disappeared instantly. Ryan stepped forward first and hugged him, then Noah, then me. It felt strange and completely natural at the same time. When I pulled away, I looked at him and smiled. It's nice to finally meet you. He smiled back. You too. Little sister. I wasn't expecting those words, little sister. Something about hearing them made this whole situation suddenly feel real, not just legally, emotionally, for the first time. I wasn't thinking about my father's betrayal. I was thinking about the brother we'd never had the chance to know. Meeting my brother in person changed something inside me. For weeks, he'd been a name, a voice on the phone, a heartbreaking story that had been dropped into the middle of our lives, but sitting across from him in that park made everything feel real. He wasn't there to make anyone feel guilty. He wasn't angry. He wasn't looking for an apology from us. He was just normal, and somehow that made everything even harder to process. We spent nearly 3 hours together that afternoon. At first, the conversation was awkward. There were so many questions, but none of us wanted to ask anything too personal too soon. Instead, we talked about ordinary things, where we grew up, what we did for work, our favorite sports teams, the kind of movies we liked. It was strange discovering how many little things we had in common despite living completely separate lives. At one point, Ryan laughed and looked at me. Have you noticed something? What? He pointed toward our brother. He talks with his hands exactly like Dad. The three of us looked at each other, then almost at the same time we laughed. Even my brother shook his head. I guess genetics are weird. It was the first time we'd laughed together as siblings. It felt nice. While we were talking, my nephew wandered over to a nearby playground with his mom. He still looked tired, but he had enough energy to climb onto a swing. We all watched him for a moment. I still can't believe how much better he's doing, I said. My brother smiled without taking his eyes off his son. There were days when I wasn't sure we'd ever get here. His voice became quieter. I don't think people realize how terrifying it is to watch your child get weaker and not be able to fix it. None of us spoke. There were nights I'd sit beside his hospital bed after he fell asleep and wonder if I was running out of time. He swallowed hard. When the doctors said we needed to find a donor, I knew I had to try everything. I looked at him. I'm really glad you ignored Dad. He gave me a sad smile. So am I. Eventually, the conversation turned to the subject we'd all been avoiding, our father. I don't hate him, my brother said quietly. That surprised all of us. You don't? Noah asked. He shook his head. I spent too many years wishing things had been different, but carrying anger around wasn't helping anyone. Ryan frowned. After everything, I didn't have a dad growing up. I had my mom, I had my grandparents, I had friends. My life wasn't perfect. But it wasn't miserable either. He looked toward the playground again. The only thing that really upset me was knowing my son might lose his chance to live because of decisions none of us made. I couldn't imagine having that much compassion. If I'd been in his position, I'm honestly not sure I would have handled it so gracefully. Before we left the park, my nephew walked over holding a small toy dinosaur. He looked up at me and smiled. Are you my aunt? My heart melted. I am, he grinned. I've never had an aunt before, I laughed. Well, I've never had a nephew before. He held the dinosaur out toward me. His name is Rex. That's a pretty cool name. He goes everywhere with me. I spent the next 10 minutes listening to a 7-year-old explain the entire backstory of a plastic dinosaur. It was adorable. More importantly, it was normal. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I wasn't thinking about hospitals or betrayal. I was simply enjoying being around family. A few weeks later, Mom finally agreed to meet my brother. She was nervous. Honestly, so was he. Before they met, he asked me something that broke my heart. Do you think she'll hate me? I answered immediately. No, you didn't do anything wrong, he nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. The meeting took place at my grandmother's house. Nothing fancy, just coffee and homemade pie. Grandma insisted that if people were going to have difficult conversations, they should at least have something good to eat. That sounded exactly like her. When my brother walked through the front door, Mom stood up. For a second, nobody moved, then he quietly said, "I'm sorry." Mom looked confused. "What are you apologizing for? I know my existence caused you a lot of pain." Without saying a word, she walked over and hugged him, a long hug. When they finally stepped apart, she looked him in the eyes. "You have nothing to apologize for." Tears filled his eyes. "So do you?" Mom gently touched his shoulder. "The choices your father made were never your fault." I don't think there was a single dry eye in the room. At that moment, something became incredibly clear. Thanks for watching. This story isn't over yet. The rest of the story continues in part 2, so make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss it.